Welcome to the deep dive, where we take these massive moments in history and really try to break them down for you.
And today we're tackling a truly enormous one, the Neolithic transition. This is that fundamental shift from humans hunting and gathering to actually producing their own food.
Yeah.
It basically sets the stage for, well, everything that follows.
Yeah, it's huge. We're going to be looking at a pretty wide time frame here, roughly 7,000 down to about 2000 BCE. So that covers the Neolithic itself, the Neolithic, Chalcolithic villages.
Exactly. And our focus is going to be mainly on the Indian subcontinent, which offers some really complex and fascinating example of how this whole process played out differently in different places.
So our goal today is to first quickly get a handle on the big theories about why this happened at all. And then, crucially, look at the actual concrete archaeological proof, the stuff archaeologists dig up that tells us how these early farmers lived. We'll look at key sites like Marigar, maybe Burzahome.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's start with that big question. Humans were hunter-gatherers for what? Hundreds of thousands of years. And pretty successful at it, too. Why did groups suddenly, relatively speaking, start settling down, farming, breeding animals? What kicked off this so-called Neolithic revolution?
Well, the earliest ideas really focus on the environment. V. Gordon Childe, a foundational figure in archaeology, he suggested that major climate change at the end of the Pleistocene, the last ice age, led to widespread drying up, desiccation.
Ah, the oasis theory, right?
That's the one. Childe's argument was that this drying forced people, animals, and useful plants to cluster around the few remaining water sources like oases or river valleys. And this sort of enforced closeness naturally led to a kind of mutual dependence, which eventually resulted in domestication.
Okay, but climate change had happened before, hadn't it, without everyone suddenly becoming farmers, so it can't just be the climate.
Exactly. And that was Robert Braidwood's point. He pushed back against climate being the sole driver. Braidwood argued that domestication wasn't necessarily about stress, but maybe more about opportunity. It happened, he thought, in what he called nuclear zones.
Nuclear zones?
Yes, specific areas, often hilly flanks of mountains, that were naturally rich in the wild ancestors of key domesticates like wild wheat, barley, sheep, goats. Braidwood felt it was more a result of people just getting better acquainted with their environment, experimenting over time, eventually figuring out how to manage these resources more intensively, kind of a natural progression.
Right, makes sense, but then you bring in population, and that changes the picture again. Louis Binford, he had a different angle.
He did. Binford came at it from a demographic perspective. His core idea was that, look, stable hunter-gatherer groups, if things are going okay, they probably won't fundamentally change their way of life. Why would they? The pressure, he argued, had to come from outside.
So like external stress.
Yeah. He specifically suggested rising sea levels at the end of the Pleistocene might have pushed coastal populations inland. These incoming groups would disrupt the existing balance between people and resources in those inland areas, creating population pressure and forcing everyone to find new ways to get enough food, like agriculture.
Okay, so environmental stress, natural experimentation in rich zones, population pressure, and then Kent Flannery came along and sort of shifted the focus.
Right. Flannery wasn't so much focused on the initial spark, but more on why the process, once started, took off. He talked about positive feedback loops.
How does that work?
Well, take maize, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Even a small human intervention, like planting kernels from a slightly better cob, could lead to increased productivity, bigger cobs, more grain. Once people saw that benefit, even a minor one, they'd likely do it again, maybe more intentionally. This reinforces the behavior. The plant changes more. The benefits increase. It becomes a self-accelerating cycle. Domestication becomes adaptive. It just works better.
So looking at all these theories, Childe, Braidwood, Binford, Flannery, the big takeaway isn't that one of them is right and the other's wrong. It's more complex.
Absolutely. Given that agriculture popped up independently in so many different parts of the world, West Asia, China, the Americas, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, each with its own environment and history, well, it seems almost certain that different factors or combinations of factors were at play in different places. Maybe stress in one area, opportunity in another, population pressure somewhere else.
Okay, so the why is complicated, a mix of things. Let's move to the how. How do archaeologists actually know? How can you tell from looking at some old bones or seeds that people were intentionally farming or breeding, not just, gathering wild stuff or maybe taming a single animal? What's the proof?
The really solid proof comes down to morphological change. That just means changes in the actual physical form, the structure, of the plants and animals themselves, caused by humans selecting for certain traits over generations.
Right. So for animals, what kind of changes are we talking about? What do you look for in the bones?
Generally, one of the first signs is size reduction. Early domestic animals are often smaller than their wild cousins. We also see specific changes in the skeleton, things like smaller teeth. Sometimes certain teeth, like premolars or third molars, might even disappear over time. You can also see changes like shorter faces or smaller horns.
And these changes, they wouldn't happen overnight, right? This takes time.
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds, usually thousands of years for these changes to become really obvious in the archaeological record. That's why indirect clues are also super important.
Like what?
Well, finding animal remains way outside their natural habitat is a big clue. Imagine finding bones of a mountain goat species down on a flat river plain. That suggests humans brought them there. But even more telling is analyzing the age and sex profiles of the animal bones found at a site.
How does that work?
In a wild herd that's being hunted randomly, you'd expect a fairly natural distribution of ages and sexes. But if people are managing a herd, you often see a very specific pattern. Lots of young males killed off, probably for meat, while the females are kept much longer, into old age, for breeding. That skewed ratio is a strong indicator of domestication.
Okay, that makes sense. What about plants? You mentioned changes there too. What's the key difference between a wild wheat stalk and a domesticated one?
For cereal grains, the absolute key is the rachees. That's the little stem part that holds the individual grain kernel to the main stalk.
Okay.
In wild cereals, the rachees is brittle. When the grain is ripe, it shatters easily, scattering the seeds naturally. That's how the wild plant reproduces. But domesticated cereals have a tough rachees. It doesn't shatter on its own. The grains stay on the stalk until a human harvests it and threshes it, beats it to separate the grain.
Ah, so the plant actually becomes dependent on humans to spread its seeds.
Exactly. It's lost its natural ability to disperse. That mutation for a tough rachees is a disadvantage in the wild, but a huge advantage for farmers because they don't lose the grain before harvest. Finding grains with that tough rachees is basically definitive proof of domestication.
Wow, that's a really neat biological marker. So finding these tiny, often burned bits of plants, how is that even done?
It relies on a technique called paleobotany or archaeobotany. And a crucial method we use is flotation.
Flotation, like floating things in water.
Pretty much. You take soil samples from the archaeological dig very carefully, and you slowly introduce them into water, often in a specialized machine. The heavier stuff, dirt, pebbles, small artifacts, sinks to the bottom. But the light carbonized plant remains, like ancient seeds or charcoal fragments, they float.
And you just scoop them off the top?
Essentially, yes. They get caught in very fine sieves. It's incredibly effective for recovering really tiny botanical evidence that would otherwise be missed.
Clever. And I guess there are other scientific methods, too, that look at the wider environment.
Right. We could use things like phytolith analysis. Phytoliths are microscopic silica structures from plant cells that survive really well in soil. Different plants produce different shaped phytoliths. And there's also palynology, which is the study of ancient pollen grains. Both of these can tell us about the types of plants growing in an area, indicating things like forest clearance or the presence of cultivated fields, even if we don't find the actual seeds.
So we've got the theories on why, the ways to find proof morphological change, flotation, pollen. Now let's apply this to the Indian subcontinent. Where do we see the earliest signs, and what did it look like? You mentioned it wasn't uniform.
Not at all. It's really a mosaic. Different things happening in different places at different times, but arguably the most significant early site, the one that really pushed back the timeline for agriculture in the region, is Mehrgarh. It's in Baluchistan, in modern Pakistan.
Right. Mehrgarh, excavated from the 70s onwards, and the dates are incredibly early, aren't they? Like 8th to 6th millennia BCE.
Astonishingly early. And the key finding there, the smoking gun for agriculture, was the barley. They didn't just find wild barley or domesticated barley. They found wild barley, transitional forms, and fully domesticated 6-row barley, all in stratified layers.
Wow. So you can literally see the process happening in the ground layers.
Exactly. It strongly suggests that North Baluchistan was a primary center, a nuclear area for barley domestication. They also found domesticated wheat there, too, early types like einkorn and emmer.
What about how they lived? What were their houses like?
In the earliest periods, they lived in rectangular mud brick structures, quite standardized, actually. What's really interesting is that the very earliest phase, period on, was largely a ceramic.
Meaning no pottery.
Mostly, yes. They must have relied on baskets, maybe leather containers, things that don't usually survive. A few bits of pottery appear later in period on, but initially it's a farming community without pots, which is quite fascinating. But they weren't isolated
How can we tell?
from the burials. Even in the earliest levels, graves contained items like turquoise beads, lapis lazuli.
Which aren't local materials, right?
Not at all. Lapis probably came from northeastern Afghanistan or Central Asia, hundreds of kilometers away. They also found marine shells, clearly from the Makran coast, which is about 500 kilometers from Mehrgar. So right from the start, these early farmers were part of long-distance exchange networks.
That's incredible, and I assume the animal evidence matches the plant evidence.
Perfectly. The lowest, earliest layers at Mehrgar are dominated by bones of wild animals, gazelle, wild sheep, wild goats, wild cattle. But as you move up through the layers into later phases of period I, there's a dramatic shift. Wild animal bones decrease sharply, and bones of domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats become dominant. It's a textbook case of the transition to herding.
Okay, so Mehrgar is huge for barley and wheat in the west. What about other areas? You mentioned rice.
Yes, moving eastward into the Vindhyan region around the Ganges Plains. This area seems to have been an independent center for rice domestication, which makes sense because wild rice is native there.
Any specific sites that stand out?
A site called Mahagara is quite interesting. They found evidence of what looks like a large cattle pen. It was an irregular enclosure, roughly 12.5 by 7.5 meters, marked out by post holes where a fence would have been. And inside, the ground was packed with clustered hoof prints.
Hoof prints, preserved.
Yes, preserved in the soil. The density suggested they might have been keeping maybe 40 to 60 head of cattle penned up in there. It points towards managed herding.
Fascinating. Okay, one more region up north in Kashmir, the site of Burzahom. It sounds quite different.
Very different. Burzahom means place of birch in Kashmiri. The really distinctive thing there, especially in the earlier Neolithic phase, are the pit dwellings.
People living in pits.
Apparently so. These were circular or oval pits dug down into the ground, sometimes nearly 4 meters deep. The standard interpretation is that these were dwellings probably for winter to escape the cold. They often had steps cut into the sides and evidence of hearths, but usually the hearths were found at ground level outside the pits, suggesting maybe summer cooking areas.
Living 4 meters down in a pit sounds challenging, especially with fire.
It does raise questions, and this is where we need that critical thinking. Some archaeologists have pointed out, based on experimental archaeology and parallels, like with Iron Age pits in Britain, that living in such a deep pit with an open fire inside would likely cause serious problems with smoke inhalation.
So what's the alternative theory?
The alternative is that maybe these pits weren't primarily dwellings, but perhaps large underground storage silos for grain, perhaps sealed up with people living in lighter structures above ground, or maybe even migrating seasonally during the harshest part of winter. We don't know for sure, but it reminds us not to just accept the obvious interpretation.
Good point. What else did they find at Burzahom? Any unique tools or art?
Yes, they had polished stone tools, bone tools, and these characteristic stone tools with holes drilled through them, often called harvesters. Their function isn't totally certain, and perhaps most famously, from a later period, period 2, there's an engraved stone slab. It depicts a hunting scene, a hunter with a bow and arrow, another figure spearing a large stag that has antlers.
So even with farming likely established, hunting was still clearly important.
Absolutely. It highlights that the transition wasn't necessarily a complete replacement. Hunting, gathering, farming, herding, these things often coexisted for a very long time.
Okay, let's pull back a bit for the final part. The so what? What did this massive shift, settling down, relying on farming and herding, actually mean for people, for society, for individuals?
Well, the impacts were profound, and maybe not all positive, especially initially. Let's talk about health. Studies comparing skeletal remains suggest that early farmers' diets, while perhaps more reliable, were often less varied than hunter-gatherer diets.
More carbs, less protein, and variety.
Generally, yes. Heavy reliance on cereals could lead to nutritional deficiencies, and living close together in settled villages, often with domestic animals nearby, created conditions where infectious diseases could spread much more easily than among mobile hunter-gatherer bands.
Do we see evidence of health declining?
In some cases, yes. Studies have shown evidence of increased infectious disease markers on bones. Dental health also seems to have suffered. That reliance on starchy carbohydrates could lead to more cavities and dental problems. You mentioned Mehrgar earlier. They actually found human teeth from that site showing signs of drilling with flint tools.
Drilling teeth, like early dentistry.
It looks like it. Possibly to relieve pain from abscesses or decay. It's incredible evidence of early attempts to deal with these new health challenges.
Wow. Okay, so potential health downsides. What about population?
That's where farming really changed things. Sedentary life likely reduced the physical stress on women, perhaps leading to healthier pregnancies and births. Also, weaning children onto softer, processed cereal-based foods might have allowed for shorter intervals between births compared to hunter-gatherer societies where prolonged breastfeeding is common.
So more babies surviving, born closer together, leads to population growth.
Exactly. Agriculture fueled population growth, which in turn required more intensive agriculture. Another one of those feedback loops.
And socially, how did life change? Did gender roles shift?
Social organization had to become more complex. Farming requires long-term planning, saving seed for next year, storing surplus, managing land. That's very different from the more immediate focus of hunter-gatherers. As for gender, it's hard to say definitively, but many scholars argue women likely played a central role, especially in early plant domestication.
Building on traditional gathering knowledge.
Precisely. And think about pottery. Once pottery develops, it's crucial for cooking grains, making porridge or gruel, and for storage. Given women's likely roles in food preparation and storage, it's quite possible they were key innovators in developing ceramic technology too.
That makes sense. And this need for planning and storage, does it lead to more complex societies overall? Specialization.
It seems to. We start seeing evidence for craft specialization at various sites. Mehrgar had bead making. At sites like Ganeshwar in Rajasthan, there's evidence for early copper working, suggesting specialized artisans. Communal life also seems to become more organized.
How so?
Take the site of Booty Hall in South India. It's associated with these large ash mounds, which are thought to be accumulated dung from cattle pens periodically burned. Near one of these mounds, archaeologists found a huge, carefully prepared plastered floor area over 200 square meters.
What was it used for?
It was covered in cattle bones, many showing cut marks. The interpretation is that this was a large-scale butchering floor, likely used for community feasts or some kind of ceremonial sharing of meat. That implies a level of social organization and cooperation beyond just individual families.
Interesting. What about beliefs? Did this new reliance on crops and herds change how people saw the world?
It likely did. We find things like terracotta female figurines, sometimes called mother goddesses, though we need to be cautious with that label. The famous Zob, mother goddesses style, comes from related contexts. We also see lots of terracotta figurines of humped bulls, especially at sites like Mehrgar.
Suggesting a focus on fertility.
That's the common interpretation. When your life depends on the fertility of your fields and your animals, it makes sense that fertility, human, animal, crop, would become a major focus of concern and, likely, ritual activity. Of course, these figurines could also be toys or portraits or something else entirely. We have to be careful not to impose our own ideas. But the emphasis seems to shift. So wrapping up the view from the subcontinent, the main point is that this wasn't a single event. It was slow, gradual, complex. Different groups experimented, adopted different strategies. You had Neolithic farmers, Chalcolithic people starting to use copper, and hunter-gatherers all living on the same landscape, interacting for thousands of years.
Right. And the source material really emphasizes that these early steps, these experiments in controlling nature, were absolutely fundamental. They laid the groundwork for everything that came later, bigger villages, eventually towns, and the first cities.
We talked about that tangible evidence, the changes in animal bones, that crucial tough rachis in the grains. Those are the changes that we can see archaeologically, but remember, they took maybe thousands of years of selection to become visible.
So here's something to think about. If those physical changes took millennia to show up in the archaeological record, imagine all the tiny, unrecorded decisions, the day-to-day experiments, the trial and error made by those completely anonymous first farmers in the generations before we can even detect the change. What choices did they make? What knowledge did they gain that we'll never recover? The real revolution might have started long before we can actually measure it.